Greetings from New Zealand. My name is Daniel Batten. What you're about to see is about putting the brakes on climate change. Not accelerating less fast, putting the brakes on now. It's not going to save the world in itself, but it might earn us more time to save the world, and time might be the greatest gift that we have.
I'm an environmentalist, an activist, and now founder of a ClimateTech VC fund. We invest in technologies that can reduce climate change, the global issue that I care about the most. The research you're about to see comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations Environment Programme. 6 years of satellite surveys from NASA and the Environmental Defence Fund, and official data from the International Energy Agency. Here's what we know. Climate change is happening faster than our models predicted. Sea levels are rising twice the predicted level. We have extreme weather events we weren't supposed to have for another 30 years. And for the first time in history, climate change just decided the election results of a major industrialized nation. We thought this would affect our children's children. It's affecting us now. And until recently, no one had a clue why. Last year, we found out. Methane. It's produced in huge quantities from 3 major sources: animal agriculture, the oil and gas industry, and landfills. Methane accounts for 25% of all climate change, and it is an 80 times more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. In 2016, NASA and the Environmental Defence Fund started taking detailed aerial surveys of methane emissions. They looked at 2 of the 3 sources, landfills and flared gas from the oil and gas industry. Now, the United Nations Environmental Protection Agency had estimated landfill emission levels. Here's their estimates. And here's the actual results of 6 years NASA satellite data. It's 2.3 times worse than we thought. We found this out last year. Same year, the Environmental Defence Fund used precise satellite imaging to measure 1,200 flared gas sites in Texas. Here's the EPA estimate, and here's the actual satellite data. It's 3.5 times worse. That's 3.5 times more of a greenhouse gas that's 80 times more potent, more warming than carbon dioxide. This was not factored into any of our climate models. After this data was released, Inger Anderson, the executive director of the United Nations Environment Programme, came out with a revised statement about methane and climate change. Cutting methane is the strongest lever we have to slow climate change over the next 25 years. Now there's some good news. Methane only stays in the atmosphere for around 9 years. Well, that doesn't mean we can say, oh well, let's just ride those 9 years out. No. With the volume of methane we're emitting, 9 years is enough to cause permanent, irreversible climate feedback loops and tip us over the critical 1.5 degrees Celsius of temperature rise that global leaders agree threaten life on this planet. We've already seen 1.1 degree of temperature rise, so we only have 0.4 degree of wiggle room left to go. I said I was going to share some good news. Well, the good news is that because methane is such a superheater, if we can reduce these methane levels, the impact will be felt almost immediately. That's why the United Nations Environment Programme also said, in this message of hope, that cutting human-caused methane by 45% this decade would avoid nearly 0.3 degrees of global warming. This just became my most important mission. I was working on a philanthropic project to change the way we do education. That project and others too aren't going to matter that much if we fail to do this. So how do we do this? Well, 2 ways. According to the United Nations Environment Programme, this is the first way. Plant-based diets is no longer a lifestyle choice. They say it's an existential choice. Well, how we do that is large coordinated behaviour change at a societal level, which I have no idea how to do en masse. However, the second way I know something about, and that's because it involves something I've spent 22 years building and investing in, and that's technology. The second way is we slash our methane emissions from landfills and oil fields using the most suitable technology we have available to us today. So how do we do that? Well, firstly, we need to understand what flaring is and why it happens. Flaring means the routine burning of gas from landfills, oil fields, and other places. It happens because when, for example, an oil company hits oil, they don't just hit oil, they hit natural gas. And because typically their oil fields are many miles from a gas pipeline, it's just not economical to build a pipeline to transport it, so they burn it. That's called flaring. But flaring doesn't solve the issue, as we're about to see. Methane is invisible to the human eye, but not to these infrared cameras, which is what you're watching now. These black plumes are methane. Now, even though the methane has been flared, some of it is still getting into the atmosphere, as you can see. In fact, 8% of it is, according to the data. And because methane is 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide, that's enough to cause climate havoc. Okay, so flaring's a really bad idea. It's environmentally harmful and economically wasteful, so hey, why not just install a generator, convert that gas into electricity? Well, now we're getting closer to the solution. But the problem is, what do we use that electricity for? Residential heating? Hospitals? EVs? No. See, that electricity has to be transported through these things, pylons. And these things cost around $2 million per mile. If you're miles from an oil rig, that's seldom economical. Okay, so what can we use the electricity for? It would have to be something that would be happy to sit right next to a landfill or inside an oil field. Well, that's not going to be residential housing or hospitals. Fancy living next to this? No, neither does anyone else. See, methane isn't just a climate nightmare, it's a health nightmare, responsible for 700,000 premature deaths each year. And the problem is, you have no flexibility to ramp up or down how much power you need, which means unless you have the added expense of batteries too, you have to use that power at a steady rate night and day. Well, who wants to do that? Well, that's a very forgiving type of customer, one who's happy to locate next to one of these, or in an oil field. They have to use that power day and night with no flexibility to increase or decrease the power they need. Well, there's only one type of customer in the world that fits that profile, and that's Bitcoin miners. No one else fits that profile, which means Bitcoin mining is the best positioned technology in the world to solve two of the three most pressing methane emission problems we have. That's why Crusoe Energy, one of the world's first miners using flared gas, has just gained $505 million of investment, including the ClimateTech funds, G2 Ventures, and Generate Capital, and the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Oman, who all saw that it didn't just tick their ESG boxes, it went well beyond that to solving a pressing environmental issue. What Crusoe do is they burn this gas in a generator that creates electricity. The electricity is used to mine Bitcoin. The process reduces the escaping methane from 8% down to 0.1%. That's an 80 times reduction in methane levels. These generators and the mobile mining units can be set up and removing methane from the atmosphere within a week in most cases. With landfills, the process is the same. The only difference is you first purify the gas before you send it to the generator. Flared gas and landfills together account for at least 41% of all human-made methane emissions, and Bitcoin mining can remove more than half of that, meaning that Bitcoin mining can reduce 23% of our entire global methane emissions. Now let's remember that quote from earlier. Cutting human-caused methane by 45% would avoid nearly 0.3 degrees Celsius of global warming. In other words, cutting human-caused methane by 23% decreases global warming by around 0.15%. Well, hang on a minute. That's what Bitcoin mining does. Are you getting this? At a time when we're only 0.4 degrees away from crossing the dangerous and potentially irreversible tipping point of 1.5 degrees Celsius rise since pre-industrial levels, this is huge. This is the reason that every ESG fund in the world should be behind Bitcoin mining. This is the reason every environmental organization should be behind Bitcoin mining. And this is the reason every Bitcoiner should know they're not just helping build the rails of the world's financial system, they're also helping to reduce climate change at the time when we need this more than ever before. And because we live in an age of consequences, not knowing this is no longer an acceptable state of awareness. That means that increasing our awareness of these facts is part of how we decrease the risk of climate change. And this is where I can't do this alone. I need your help. There's 3 ways that you can help. Number 1, every time you see a fund who claims to care about the environment, ESG, or reducing climate change, make sure they know these facts. Number 2, every time you meet an environmental group whose reason to be is to protect our fragile earth, make sure they know these facts. And thirdly, with other Bitcoiners who don't know this yet, share this message with them. Ask them to share it too, because if enough people know this and act on this, well, it's still not enough by itself to save the world, but we will have bought us more time. And that could be the greatest hope we have.